is ranked the fifth most vulnerable nation to the impact of climate change, with 2.5 to 4.5% of its GDP at risk annually. However, climate-related investments from both public and private sources remain limited. An upcoming study by CPI finds that India is mobilizing less than 25% of the investment needed to reach this target. To put it in perspective, India roughly needs 3 times the total investment made in the infrastructure sector in the last decade to fight climate change for this decade. Crises often present us with opportunities to rebuild a better world. If anything, the disruption brought about by COVID-19 has further highlighted why sustainable practices must be at the core of both financial and economic thinking. The pandemic is reshaping the world, and as countries look to rebuild economies, corporates must be encouraged to place sustainability at the heart of their investment for transformation and avoid the pitfalls of a business-as-usual high-carbon path.
COVID-19 has brought into sharp focus the urgent need to make economies more resilient. In the case of India, which was already reeling under economic slowdown, the pandemic has further exacerbated the structural fault lines of our growth pathway. A study conducted by Stanford University, for instance, has estimated that global warming caused the Indian economy to be 31% smaller than it would otherwise have been, and therefore climate change is no longer something that we can afford to ignore. It has in fact emerged as one of the most formidable challenges to sustained GDP growth across the world, and to accelerate the implementation of India's commitments to Sustainable Development Goals and Paris Agreement. Finance is going to play a key role. Now, various estimates suggest that India requires about $2.5 trillion to meet its climate action changes between 2015 and 2030 under the Paris Agreement, and similarly, the financing gap to achieve Sustainable Development Goals in developing countries is estimated at anywhere between $2.5 to $3 trillion, which means that every year India requires at least $170 billion to finance its actions to tackle climate change. But right now, the total annual green investments has only been about $19 billion on average. For instance, a report by Climate Policy Initiative said that green finance flows in India have totaled about 1.11 lakh crores in FY17, which is about $17 billion, and then about $19 billion in FY18. So you can see the large gap there. So yes, domestic private investors have been contributing. They've been the largest contributors in both of these years. But the report also noted that the Indian government's initiatives, including expenditure undertaken by dedicated public sector undertakings on climate-related mitigation activities, has also more than doubled between these years, and the budgetary allocation has also increased by as much as 36%. Now, the last economic survey also interestingly noted that India is now the second largest emerging green bond market after China, and it recorded $10.3 billion worth of transactions in the first half of 2019. But despite all of this, scarce financial resources continue to be a constraint in meeting India's commitments under the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. Now, experts also are now worrying that the economic fallout of COVID-19 could perhaps influence climate action as well, where a resource-constrained government may deprioritize climate change mitigation at a time when risks from global warming are actually getting more pronounced. But the opportunity also remains very large. For instance, the International Finance Corporation, they estimate that climate finance is a $3.1 trillion opportunity in India alone, and therefore we must align our growth and recovery goals with greening and sustainability.
Hello and welcome to The Making with me, Shereen Bhan, a special show that speaks to business leaders from across sectors to understand how this journey of transformation was brought about, the challenges around it, and the heartwarming and encouraging human stories that add life to all aspects around an organization's massive remake in the post-COVID-19 reality. With me today, I have Rajat Verma, the Managing Director and Head Commercial Banking at HSBC India, and it's also my pleasure to invite Ashish Bhandari, the Managing Director and CEO of Thermax, for joining us on this very special series where we will talk about financing India's green future. Gentlemen, appreciate you joining us here on the program. Rajat, before we talk about sustainable financing, let me ask you about what the big changes have been when it comes to dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic from a people's perspective, from an operations perspective. This is as much an economic story as it is a human story. What have been the big changes that you've been able to bring about?
Well, I think the biggest change, of course, is that we challenged almost every assumption that we had prior to the pandemic. So how people work, how they communicate with each other, For example, work from home, which was probably anything in the range of 5 to 10%. Today, we're thinking of our Hong Kong office announced that we could have 4 out of 5 days work from home. Uh, the the other angles around COVID is that it's brought a lot more of thought into sector thinking in the banking world. We started to think of how greater macroeconomic changes like COVID will impact specific sectors, which has been so you could sit in April and think of which are the sectors which are going to get impacted by COVID, and actually kind of draw out a map of who's going to do well and who's not going to do well. I think the other kind of big change is that it's brought a lot of reflection to banks as well. So as part of that reflection, and I'm so glad that it kind of leads into the topic of today's discussion, is that it started financial institutions to start thinking more deeply about the environment and sustainable financing. So our group CEO as well spoke about it during the course of the pandemic, and I think if I remember, my memory serves me right, he started by saying that the pandemic has shaped or accelerated or catalyzed the thinking on sustainable finance, and we've kind of upped our aspirations on that very, very significantly. So despite all the challenges and the health challenges and the family stories, etc., I think I'm an optimist, so I'm taking that this hopefully will lead us to a better world in more ways than we can imagine currently.
Well, we certainly hope that that is in fact the case. In fact, to your point that we've seen an acceleration towards sustainable financing, here are some numbers and some food for thought. Top ESG funds, that's environmental, social and governance focused funds, have added 27% in their assets under management in the first quarter of FY21. India's ESG funds have attracted $500 million during the lockdown. And of course, the hope is that this trend will continue. Ashish, thanks very much for joining us. Let me start by asking you, the infrastructure sector was a sector that was deeply impacted on account of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's had its legacy trouble, of course, to deal with as well. Given where things currently stand, where are we in the course of recovery? Are you, for instance, getting back on a plane anytime soon?
First thing I would say, just like Rajat said, the past few months have first and foremost been a human story of all of our employees at Thermax finding a way to first manage ourselves with safety. And then once we had to get started, just the activity that was needed to get all our plants and our hundreds of sites up and running, working with customers was a miracle. And sometimes it brings out the best of India. The way we can put 1 and 2 together and find a way to just get moving again. So that was incredible for me to see. As you mentioned, the infrastructure sector in India has been through a slowdown, and it's not just because of COVID. You could take the last 7 or 8 years, and it's been a difficult story. I think for companies like Thermax, it is not a question of looking at infrastructure as a segment specifically, but start to retool our companies to be ready for where the world is going. And where the world is going is, and sustainability is a great example, is a move away from mega projects that are infrastructure related to a lot more of a distributed world, a smaller set of projects, lot more sustainability driven projects. So instead of having one mega refinery, you could have hundreds of small biomass-based plants or bio-CNG plants or waste-to-recovery plants, waste-to-energy recovery plants. And companies like Thermax, we have to retool how we look at the market to be able to gain from some of these changes and actually accelerate those changes by bringing funding, technology, everything that we have at our disposal, bring them together to make India better and then make Thermax better in the process as well.
before I talk about the financing aspect of it, let's talk about this retooling that you spoke of. While there is an awareness within Thermax on how you should prepare yourself for what you believe is likely to be a changed landscape, what are your clients telling you? I mean, one of the things that COVID has perhaps accelerated is this move towards a distributed workforce. You're saying that we're likely to move towards distributed manufacturing as well. We're likely to put much more focus on the ESG goals within organizations. What are clients telling you at this point in time? Are you starting to see that kind of reorientation being accelerated?
Very much so, Shireen. Even in these last 2 to 3 months, on the capital side, the projects that have all started and starting to get funded are 1 to 3 year payback projects. All of them have got some amount of green element. For us, for example, the biggest application that we have is waste heat recovery, where cement plants, steel plants use waste heat recovery to get additional energy within their plants. Yeah, so customers are coming and saying, okay, this is a 1 to 3 year payback. It meets my sustainability goal as well. I'm ready to start this as the first capex that I want to get started on. Wet paper, plastics, things that were considered untouchables a few years ago. Technology is finding ways to bring them back, but they are not gigantic plants. They're all very, very local, very distributed, but extremely interesting projects from a Thermax perspective.
Well, it's good to hear that CapEx is picking up. And if green CapEx is going to actually be at the forefront of driving this CapEx recovery, then that's double good news. But let me get Rajat back into the conversation. Rajat, just to pick up on the financing aspect that Ashish spoke of, and we have seen financing picking up, whether it's in India or globally, not to the tune of what is our requirement or what is the need, but nevertheless, a start has been made. One of the concerns or a challenge really for ESG investing was the lack of a benchmark, the lack of a metric, and there was confusion on classification. With what now has been put forward by the World Economic Forum and the global Big Four in terms of drawing out the stakeholder capitalism metrics, do you believe that that will now further enhance the move towards sustainable financing?
The basic hypothesis is, as you mentioned, Shireen, is that the amount of investment required in renewable energy and in sustainability goals is a very humongous investment, which possibly cannot be met only by public means, and therefore you need to have more private investment coming into the future. And as a first step to that, to answer your question specifically, is that you have to be able to tag correctly green loans, green bonds, sustainable financing, and to be able to create a more liquid market and to bring financing of this nature into the mainstream. So this forum and several others that you've mentioned, I think the goal is really to have this kind of transparency and benchmarking and tagging of such initiatives. And my own understanding of this situation is that we've moved a massive there's been a massive change in what it is today than what it was, say, a year and a half or 2 years back. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's quite encouraging.
It certainly is encouraging. But Ashish, let me ask you about what you believe it will take to actually deepen the financing market. I mean, we're talking about green bonds, we're talking about green REITs, for instance, and I would imagine that we will see, a fair amount of innovation when it comes to financial products. The EU green bond is something that people are looking at as well. There's the whole aspect of transition finance. How do you believe, specifically from an India point of view, where sustainability is one aspect, but for infrastructure, the big challenge has been viability of infrastructure projects. How do you marry the two?
Shireen, very good question. Firstly, I would say that I'm quite encouraged even on some of the steps India is taking. As an example, the MCA reporting standards for next year will require the top 1,000 companies of India to start putting out a sustainability report. Which could in the future become a template for how companies get ranked on their sustainability index, and then get financing tied up to relating to your score on that sustainability index as well. In terms of how do you get the sector moving, there are two or three uh, templates and some benchmarks that I can think of, and all of these templates ultimately require this virtuous cycle of technology, of public policy, and financing to come together. So you need all three of these to come together to get some of these sectors moving. Just one by itself may not be sufficient. I was in the US when the 2007, 2009 financial crash had happened. And right after that, there was a fund that was created as part of the economic recovery. I think it was called the ARRA fund, as part of which $90 billion was set aside by the government for clean tech and clean projects. A few of them failed, many of them succeeded, but I understand that the end result of that was that the project created 1 million years worth of jobs in the US, including funding Tesla and a lot of other examples. EU is doing something similar as after the COVID crash. So the crisis is something to take advantage of, because how the government funds recovery, what areas it looks to focus on, can drive what the future will look like. And in that sense, some of the funding through MNRE, some of the priority sectors that the government have set aside, can get benchmarked to renewables, to some of the sustainability driven sectors as well, which will then start infrastructure spend that is related to these industries. I think technology in what will be needed for India in many cases will be India specific. Yeah, I talked about agro waste, solid fuel waste, even hydrogen economies, EV. The challenges India will have will be very, very unique. So I think the solutions that India will have to develop will also be unique. And as I said, I think Rajat will have a lot more inputs into how the finance part of it will come together. But I'm very clear that the technology and the public policy have to be the other two legs of that tripod stool that has to come together.
Oh, you're absolutely correct. And I like the fact that you've given the tripod stool analogy, because we will need to have all three pillars working together for us to be able to make this a success. Rajat, technology will have to ensure that that these are products or services that are affordable, that they're accessible in the Indian context. When we talk about electric vehicles, for instance, the Indian government, and from a central point of view, and many state governments are also looking at how they can bring down the cost of battery manufacturing, because that's really a large chunk of the cost. So on the product side, on the regulatory side, there is an effort being made. But let's talk about on the financing side. What do you see as the exciting opportunities on the financing side? And secondly, currently we're living in an environment where there's easy money, with central banks basically ensuring that the accommodative monetary stance keeps the money free flowing. But if that were to change, and it's not likely to happen anytime soon, but once things do change, do you believe that we are then going to struggle to find the kind of money that's currently coming towards the ESG side?
Great question, Shireen. Let me start with the second part of your question first. I think every sector and every business proposition needs to first and foremost stand up on a commercial basis. Whatever enables that commercial basis is a secondary question. So it could be government policy. In the case of renewable energy, it could be the behavior of the off-takers. It could be the amount of equity flowing in, or there's so many policy angles to it. But I think first and foremost, we have to make sure that there is a commercial and business angle. Only then will the scalability of this segment be ensured, irrespective of all the good intentions that all of us may have. So I feel that the pandemic and the availability of liquidity that all the sovereign governments have put into their respective markets is a good time for people to think about raising and becoming stronger, and use that flexibility that the market kind of gives them. and use this window of time perhaps to become more resilient. But having said that, ultimately it's the business models and the sustainability of that business model which will determine how much of capital is going to be available and will flow in to the sector. Now, if I can step back, Shireen, and talk about use a word which is also linked, unfortunately, to the pandemic, exponential, right? So it's an unfortunate word in today's time, but it's very true for renewable energy. And you spoke about we made a start in financing, etc. There were no green bonds 3 or 4 years back, or very few. We ourselves have assisted in close to 6 billion of green bonds from India, and you can see that it's an exponential curve. The amount of renewable energy installation in the country today is 90 gigawatts. It's going to go to 450 perhaps by 2030. You can see that too is an exponential curve. Just purely by the stint of by the law of numbers. So really, I think so when Ashish spoke about the tripod and all of the three things meshing, I think that is absolutely fundamental for India to get right, and I think we are getting it right. So you can't have financing succeed if government policy or off-taker behavior is not what it needs to be for this industry to scale up. But once you have those in place, and once you have the technology in place, which was, I think, the second part of Ashish's tripod, I think then there is no real economic reason that this won't succeed. So the real point that I'm trying to make is that I think this is a commercially viable proposition for a bank and for an ESG investor and a fund. As I see technology, the cost of delivering many of these things have dramatically reduced. So it's financially viable, and that's the reason I think it'll succeed. And all of the other things are kind of following on from that.
Absolutely, we cannot wait for a pandemic or for a shutdown or a lockdown to improve our air quality standards. That certainly is not the option that we should be banking on. But Ashish, Rajat, many thanks for joining us here on this very special conversation. I think there's plenty of food for thought, and we do hope that we can continue to build on this dialogue and this discussion and nudge policymakers, industry in that direction. But thank you very much for your insights on the program. Well, it's good to go green, but it also involves investment and extensive transformation in how we do business in India. With that, it is time for us to wrap up this special edition. Over the next few weeks on The Making, we will put the spotlight on crucial decisions that leaders will need to take to ensure that their organizations not only stabilize, but also are ready for recovery. We'll talk about Indian MSMEs, the need to go global, the reshaping of global supply chains in a post-COVID era, and much more. For now, from all of us here, goodbye. Many thanks for watching.